So I guess just to talk a little bit about myself and podcasting, I'm pretty new to the podcasting game. As I mentioned, 2018 was when myself and B Magic we started doing the Immigrant Hustle podcast, and it really just came from conversations we were having. So, we'd be in the studio working on music together, and sometimes on the longer sessions, our conversations would kind of go into other places aside from the music, and people would just say, "Oh, you should put this in a podcast. You should put it in a podcast." It was like kind of an aside as a comment, but we started to think about it, and we're like, maybe we should. Maybe there is some value to it. And so we kind of brainstormed a little bit as far as if we do a podcast, what would we talk about? What would we want to cover? And initially, our thoughts was, okay, let's do a hip hop podcast. But there's so many of those, and it doesn't really. I felt like it wasn't really the best use of our time and our energy, and it wasn't really contributing much. To, I guess, just dialogue and the things that matter to us as far as arts and culture. So we brainstormed a little bit, and that's where we kind of came up with the concept of the Immigrant Hustle. And as I mentioned, we interview a lot of folks from a variety of fields. We've had rappers, singers, poets, authors, athletes, teachers, people who work in the field of politics, photographers, personal trainers, activists, fashion designers, just a smorgasbord of everybody who's doing anything. And the common thread between all of them is that they all are either children of immigrants or refugees, or they're immigrants or refugees themselves. And I guess one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on that topic in particular is because myself and B Magic, we are both, of that background. My parents came to Canada from Punjab in the 80s. And for B Magic, his family came to Canada in the 90s from Norway. So, we had very different backgrounds, but there was still that kind of common thread that connected us. And I think that's the cool thing about a lot of folks that we have on our show is that even though we're from different places, we've had folks from South Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, East Asia, everybody's from a different place in the world, but everybody's story, there's like a common thread into it, in the fact that we had to leave for a particular reason. And then when we came here, there was that process of trying to figure it out. And, what was that process of figuring it out? What were the challenges with that? And what was the resilience that they witnessed within that? And, we, as I mentioned kind of in my introduction, there's a famous quote from Justin Trudeau where he says, diversity is our strength. And we tend to, when we think about diversity, we tend to think about it very much so in kind of surface level, where we talk about, food of different cultures, music, things like that. But there's so much more to it. There are our politics, there are our ways of being, our ways of living, our ways of kind of viewing and interacting with the world. So with our podcast, it allows us to, create a platform for folks with different perspectives and different experiences to talk about what it means to be a first generation Canadian and why they had to leave. But it also gives us an opportunity to, talk about mentorship. And this is one thing I didn't really think about initially when we started the podcast, but a friend of mine really broke it down to me in a very interesting way. And so she's a filmmaker. And what she said was that, for a lot of immigrants or children of immigrants, we're brand new here. We don't have a base to fall back on. We don't have, an inheritance. We don't have social capital. So for a lot of us, we're creating everything from the ground up. And within that, there's a lack of mentorship. Just an example, when I was in university, and I was about to graduate, I didn't have a job lined up, but a lot of my friends did, because they had parents that worked for such and such company, and they were able to get internships, able to get introductory jobs and things like that. Whereas for myself and for a lot of my friends that were from immigrant backgrounds, we don't have that capital to leverage in the same way. So, and a lot of that applies to the arts too, especially in Canadian arts. We notice that a lot of arts that are created by Indigenous folks or by Black folks or people of color, it doesn't really hit the same heights as, for example, like a Tragically Hip or a Jan Arden or a Katie Lang. And it's not because of a lack of talent, but for some reason, art that kind of speaks more so to the Canadian identity, as I was talking about earlier, that tends to be more easily consumed. Whereas art created by folks that are, from immigrant backgrounds, haven't really been here that long, it takes a lot longer for it to kind of permeate the mainstream. If we look at even a local example with Brampton, for instance, 2019, Hawaii Mighty was the first time a Black woman had won the Polaris Prize. And you think about that, it took 2019 for that to happen. So with this podcast, it really allows us to talk to folks and learn about, how did they penetrate this particular craft in this field that they wanted to get into, and how did they, achieve some degree of success within it, because, they probably didn't have mentors to get there. For example, a lot of young artists that are rappers or beat makers, they talk to me, how did you get on this stage? How did you get on this platform? And because they don't have anybody in their lives to look to as mentors. So I get a lot of, emails from folks that are trying to get into the same field. And so with this podcast, we're basically creating a space where you can turn to it. Let's say if you're an artist, if you're a teacher, if you're, a chef, whatever the case is, whatever your chosen field is, whatever your passion is, you can listen to somebody else who kind of represents a similar experience to you, whether it's coming from an immigrant background, whether maybe they grew up in the same town you did, whether they're doing the same field that you're doing, and kind of understand a little bit of the blueprint and incorporate some of their experience into your own. And so that's really why we make it such a point to have such a diverse background of people from different parts of the world, but also a diversity in terms of the fields that they pursue, is because we want to try to reach as many people as possible and, provide a little bit of insight into what it's like to work in those fields and to make progress within those fields. Because chances are, if, we were coming up and we kind of felt like we had hit a wall and we didn't know how to navigate around it, someone else younger than us or someone else who's, newer in their craft might be facing the same thing. And so essentially we want to leave something behind for people that are starting up or that are young and they want to do something, but they're just not sure how to, get that foot in the door for the first time. So that's kind of the focus behind the podcast and the mentality behind it. And I think podcasting is a really interesting medium. Roberta, you mentioned it, is that, podcasts are very portable, they're accessible, and there's so much selection to it. So whatever it is you're looking for, chances are you can find a podcast that is, in line with what your interests are.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question, Noyz?
Sure.
Right now with I see a lot of Instagram Live, which is a lot of talking.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's more now or if I'm just identifying it more. Why did you choose to do podcast versus something like an Instagram Live?
I feel like with Instagram Live, once it's gone, it's gone. Once it's over, there's no way to kind of record it and have people be able to revisit it. And there is a cap. I think, I'm not sure how this works exactly, but I think there's a time limit cap on it as well. And with our podcast, we wanted to create a space for longer conversations. And again, just kind of have that permanence where it's up there, it's online. You can always turn back to it, turn it off, turn it back on whenever you need to. But I think Instagram Live has been a great way to communicate, especially during the time of COVID when we couldn't go out to shows anymore, we couldn't network anymore. And it's been a great way for artists to connect with their fan base and to connect with their colleagues. We thought about it as well. Could we do a podcast, or could we do an episode of the podcast over Instagram Live? But I guess like I said, we wanted to have a permanent place for it. We didn't want to just be, once the stream ends and it's gone.
Right. I didn't know that. Thank you.
And I think the great thing about podcasts is it's an equalizer. With talk radio, you have to pitch a story, you have to get the approval of your producers. There's a lot of kind of red tape to get through in order to get your discussion point on the air. And even then, you're kind of limited by time, ad breaks and whatnot. But with podcasting, it's very much what is it you want to say? What is the story you want to tell? Within the realm of podcasting, you have the freedom to do it as you want to do it. There's nobody to pitch to. You don't have to get approved for anything. And for the most part, they're fairly cheap to produce. When we first started out with the Immigrant Hustle in 2018, we had 4 microphones and a mixer. And I think per month, it was less than $100 from Long and McQuaid to rent that. So it can be a pretty economical way to do it, to
Mm-hmm.
to get your arts out there. And with music in particular, there's a lot that goes into it. There's writing, recording, production, mixing, mastering, and all that. But with podcasting, it's very streamlined. It's just you and another person sit down, have a conversation, you can record it, and you can get it out there. So we found that podcasting really kind of fit in line with the stories that we were trying to tell, because it is so equitable, and you don't really need a whole lot of startup to get going, to get your, to get your feet on the ground running. And it does what all great art should do. It allows us to tell stories. It opens our mind to new perspectives, new ideas, new worlds that we might not have been aware of. And if anybody is, interested in starting a podcast, there's a lot of different formats that you can have. Oh, I see we're kind of running short on time, so I'll try to get through. There's a lot of different formats. So the first podcast that I fell in love with was the Combat Jack Show, by Combat Jack, Reggie Osei. He's been involved in the music industry for such a long time, and he would just interview folks that had been in the game for a very long time, and just learn about their stories, how they came up, how they got started, certain key pivotal moments in their careers, and he would just talk about it. And I feel like we try to take a lot from that, where it's just very free-flowing interview style. There's also a narrative style, as Phelan had referred to, which you try to tell a story, you script it, and you kind of go from beginning to end in telling the story and really exploring it. And Secret Life of Canada is a great one. And another one I just learned about recently is the Nameless Collective, based out of BC, which is a group of academics and historians who look into Sikh history within Western Canada, and just kind of focusing on the past century of Canadian Sikh history. And how did we get here? What were some of the struggles that we faced? How did we get involved politically? How did we get involved with the community and things like that? So that's been a really interesting podcast. And there are some that are more talk radio style. One that's really blown up probably in the last couple of months, a Canadian one, Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. Nora Laredo, who is a journalist, and Sandy Hudson, who's been involved in BLM Toronto. So they both talk a lot about political issues going on in Toronto and in Canada, and they offer a very unique perspective on the issues that are going on. So there's a lot of different methods to podcasting, whether interview style, talk radio style, narrative style. So just kind of finding trial and error, what works for you and what is most in line with your interests, and what is the story you want to tell, and finding the most effective way to tell it. So tips for new podcasters. I guess the main thing is sound quality is big. You want to make sure you're recording on a good mic. There are certain podcast apps like Anchor, for example, where you can do it off your phone, but I've tried it, and the audio quality was not necessarily the best. So if you have the capacity to, I would recommend renting mics and a mixer from Long and McQuaid, and you can pretty much just, as a USB port, stick it into your laptop, and you can go from there. There are free audio recording and editing softwares. I use Audacity. Again, it's free, pretty simple to use. You can just kind of drag and click, cut as you need to as you edit. Microphones and setting your mic levels is also very important. So on your mixer, you could set all your channels up to the same level, but you have one individual who tends to speak louder versus another individual who tends to speak quieter. You might have to adjust your levels accordingly. I know when we first started with our podcast, that was something that took us a while to get the swing of, because I talk pretty quietly, but B Magic tends to talk a little bit louder. So we had to adjust our levels. Took us a few episodes to get our presets right. And also kind of being mindful of things like your cell phone. Like your cell phone can interfere with your microphone. And our first season was really bad in that sense, because we were learning as we went. So we would make a mistake, but it was already recorded at that point. So it's like, I guess we kind of just got to roll with it and just do better for next time. And I feel like we're learning as we go with every new episode we do. I guess focusing on the content rather than on the quantity of how much stuff you're putting out is important as well. We do have video footage that we put out with our audio, but again, video is not the focus of what we put out. It's more so the audio. And there are a lot of podcasts that are just audio specific, and they've been able to build really good fan bases with that. I'm a big, pro wrestling nerd, so I listen to a lot of wrestling podcasts. There's a podcast network called Post Wrestling, and they're pretty much strictly audio, and they've been able to build a really good community and a really good network around the fact that they're just audio. They don't necessarily have to have that visual component to it. And I guess the most important thing is don't be afraid to tell personal stories. You know, vulnerability is the way you can create strong connections with your audience. And I think with folks that, you know, tell stories on our show, they talk about migration, they talk about intergenerational trauma, they talk about mental health. These are very personal things, but these are things that don't really get spoken of within immigrant communities. And as far as mainstream Canadian media goes, there's not really a platform for us to talk about these things either. So we wanted to create this space within our podcast, within the Immigrant Hustle, to talk about some of these things that exist within immigrant communities, and, you know, just provide space for folks to be vulnerable. And, you know, through vulnerability and through being honest with our storytelling, that's the way we can create the most connection with our audience and, you know, understand folks a little bit better, especially during this time when there is a lot of political and social uproar. The best way to kind of penetrate through it and navigate through it is to listen. What voices are we not listening to? What voices are we not hearing? And I think with podcasting, even as a host, being a host allows me to listen to folks and to learn a lot more. And I see we're about to cut out. So yeah, thanks.